recognize is that I've indicated that lungs are here and tissues are there. So I am, of course, simplifying this immensely. There is not one blood vessel between your lungs and all of your tissues, or vice versa. But what I'm trying to illustrate is that blood is different in terms of which gases it has, whether it's coming from your lungs toward your tissues. So in this picture, blood is circulating in this direction. So it's passing by your lungs, going past your tissues, and then returning back to your lungs. And so it's important to recognize, first of all, the direction of blood flow. Because we'll talk about this next, and it's something that you would want to recognize, blood that is flowing towards your tissues would be in arteries in general, and blood that is flowing back from your tissues to your heart and your lungs would generally be in veins. Now there's a small exception to that when we're talking about the lungs, because blood is not going from your lungs to your tissues and back. It's technically going from your heart to your tissues and back. But we'll get to that distinction when we talk about circulation more specifically. So in general, arteries are on the right and veins are on the left. Now you'll notice in my picture that the arteries are colored red on purpose, sort of. We have the tendency to color oxygenated blood red. And we'll see that even more when we do the next section, which is your circulatory system. So what I'm going to focus on the right side of the picture is how oxygen is carried in your blood. We know that your lungs are the source of oxygen. That is where oxygen enters your body. How it does that, we already discussed by talking about the mechanics of respiration and that you have alveoli with thin membranes, so gas exchange can occur. What we're going to talk about now are ways that your blood can carry this oxygen around. So this side of the picture on the right is where oxygen is, and there are two basic ways that oxygen can be found in your blood. The first way is simply dissolved in plasma. Now when we talk about your blood, we'll often use this word plasma. Plasma is the liquid part of your blood. Plasma is essentially water. It's not 100% water, it has things dissolved in it, but plasma is around 93% water, so it's the water part of your blood, as opposed to the red and white blood cell part of your blood. When we're talking about the total amount of oxygen that is available in your body because you did some respiration, you were breathing, the dissolved in plasma oxygen only accounts for a very, very small part of it. So the dissolved in plasma portion only accounts for about 1% of the oxygen in your body. That means that the rest of the oxygen is being transported some other way. Now this picture here that looks like a circle that's cut into 4 is supposed to represent a protein called hemoglobin. Now hemoglobin, I actually mentioned way back in the beginning when we talked about what proteins can do. Proteins can have a number of roles. They can be enzymes, they can be structural. In this case, hemoglobin is a transport protein. The way hemoglobin is set up is that there are 4 sections. And so that is why this circle is divided into 4. You'll also notice in each of the sections the letters F and E. Fe is the chemical symbol for iron. So, you require iron in your blood for hemoglobin to function properly. If you have ever known anyone, or perhaps yourself, been told that you are anemic or slightly anemic, that's a condition where someone does not have enough iron in their blood, and not having enough iron would mean that you could not as effectively transport oxygen around. So each hemoglobin protein has 4 sections. That means 4 molecules of oxygen could attach themselves to hemoglobin. This is where 99% of your oxygen would be carried. Now, when oxygen attaches to hemoglobin, we call hemoglobin oxyhemoglobin. And I'm pointing this out because hemoglobin can carry other stuff too, and we'll name it slightly differently when other things are attached. So on the right side of the diagram, we are showing oxygen going into your blood from your lungs and coming out of your blood to your muscles. Now, next to the word muscles, the word myoglobin is written, and I'll just write it a little bit bigger. When we did this section on muscles, you might recall that there are 2 types of muscles, and one of the differences between the 2 types of muscles was how much myoglobin it had. Myoglobin is your muscle's protein that holds oxygen, and so your slow twitch muscle fibers had lots of this. Your fast twitch muscle fibers had very little of this. Now, your muscles are not the only tissues in the world that require oxygen, but that is a major place where cellular respiration is happening on a constant basis. So where we wrote muscles, it could realistically be any cell in your body that's trying to perform cellular respiration. Muscles would just be a huge place where oxygen would be used up. Now, regardless of which type of tissue it was, whether it was your muscles or some other cell, once blood arrives at a cell, it's going to exchange. So at your tissues, there is an exchange of gas. Oxygen will come out of your blood, and CO2 will move in. Now, we know that that's because of cellular respiration. The details of cell respiration is not what I want to focus on, just the gases. Now, carbon dioxide can be carried in your blood a few different ways. Generally, we would find that in your veins, there's lots of carbon dioxide, and in your arteries, there's lots of oxygen. Does that mean that there is 0 carbon dioxide on the right and 0 oxygen on the left? No, just that the levels are much greater for each of them on those sides. So there are 3 ways that carbon dioxide could be transported in your blood. One of them, just like for oxygen, is dissolved in plasma. This represents in the neighborhood of 9%. So a little bit more for CO2 than for oxygen. The second way, just like for oxygen, is hemoglobin. Now, hemoglobin can carry carbon dioxide as well, but it's not in the same format. So you'll notice here, my hemoglobin is still a round circle split up into 4, but carbon dioxide is not attached to all 4 sides. That's because the place where carbon dioxide attaches is slightly different than the place where oxygen attaches. When carbon dioxide is attached to hemoglobin, we call hemoglobin carb amino hemoglobin. And unlike oxygen, where this represents like basically all of the transport, this represents about 27%. Now you'll also notice if you look at the picture, I didn't write CO2 next to hemoglobin. I wrote NHCOO negative. That's because for carbon dioxide to be transported by hemoglobin, it needs to change form. And I'm not going to ask you to memorize the details of that, but just to recognize it's not officially CO2 anymore. The third way is where I'll show you an example of how carbon dioxide changes. The third way is as HCO3 negative, which is bicarbonate. Now, if you're looking at the numbers, this is the number one way that CO2 is transported, about 64%. Now, how do I get from CO2 to bicarbonate? Well, basically, there's a reaction with water. CO2 and H2O. We know that water is present because your blood has plasma in it, and like I mentioned earlier, plasma is basically water. So what happens is that carbon dioxide, when it dissolves in this part of your blood, will react with water, and essentially, water is going to donate some molecules to CO2. So if I were to combo these up, I would end up with H2CO3. That is carbonic acid. That's what I get initially. And what happens after this is that this substance splits apart into hydrogen and HCO3 negative. Now, the chemistry behind this is not the thing that I'm going to focus on. If you would like to learn about acid and base balance, you can take chem for that. I'm not going to go into huge detail there. I just want you to recognize that that's where bicarbonate comes from. CO2 reacts with water, and then the molecule dissociates or ionizes is what the term is for an acid, and I end up with a hydrogen ion and this bicarbonate. Now we said CO2 goes into your blood at your tissues, and when we arrive at your lungs, CO2 comes out. So at your lungs and at your tissues is where we have gas exchange. Now I'd like to just point out one thing because a few people maybe had a misconception about this. A number of people had thought previously that hemoglobin cannot carry carbon dioxide, and it in fact can. It's not the major way, but it can do it. It doesn't carry CO2 officially, it carries CO2 that has reacted with something already. Would anybody like to ask any questions about the ways that gases are transported in your blood? So the next thing I'd like to show you is a little bit about how your breathing is controlled, because this relates to gas levels in your blood. Just move this. So we're talking about regulation of breathing. Now, breathing is something that is under both voluntary and involuntary control. Just to make a link to things that we would have learned previously, voluntary control means striated muscle. Involuntary control means smooth muscle. And so you have some of both types of muscles kicking around in your respiratory system. A lot of the muscles are striated muscles. Those are ones that are attached to bones. So if you think about how you have ribs and a sternum, and there are muscles all over the place there that you can control, those are muscles that are under voluntary control. So what happens for your brain to control breathing automatically so that you don't have to think about it is that you have chemoreceptors. That is a receptor that detects a chemical substance. Now, where are these receptors? They are in something called your medulla oblongata. And just to give you an idea of where that is in your brain, if you look at this picture here, this is sort of a sideways picture. The top part of a person's head would be right there. And the medulla is right at the top of your spinal cord. So it's part of what we call the brain stem, the base of your brain. And this is where you have a bunch of automatic controls. So if you plan on pursuing Biology 30, there's an entire unit about your brain and how it works. And the medulla controls more than just respiration. It's actually the center for a lot of automatic functions. Now, in this part of your brain, there are these receptors, and they are sensitive to the concentration of carbon dioxide and hydrogen ions in your blood. So that means they are detecting CO2, but they are also detecting H+. And you might ask yourself, well, that's dumb. What does H+ have to do with carbon dioxide or me breathing? I'll just remind you that when CO2 reacts with water, I get those two substances, hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. And so your brain is detecting these hydrogen ions that are the byproduct of CO2 dissolving in your blood. So when the concentration of these two things increases in your blood, this stimulates your medulla, which stimulates your intercostal muscles and your diaphragm, and it's stimulating them to contract. Remember that when muscles contract, that pulls your rib cage up and out, pulls your diaphragm down, makes more room in your thoracic cavity so air can rush in. This speeds up the rate at which you are breathing. And so just to give you an idea of what your brain does to cause you to breathe, yes, of course, it's stimulating muscles, but there are actually a lot of places in your body that are sending signals to your brain. So if this is your brain up here, your brain receives information from not just your blood, but actually from a lot of places about breathing. We're going to focus on the blood part because we're talking about gas exchange. But so that you know, there are receptors all over the place. These two pictures represent a lung. And so there are receptors in your lungs that detect stretching and that detect irritants, things that are bothering your lung tissue. And they can both send signals to your brain. So this yellow piece in the middle here is supposed to be your medulla. And they both send signals to your medulla telling you that maybe we should try breathing, or maybe we should stop breathing so much. Now there are chemoreceptors here and here. Some of them are in your blood vessels themselves. Some of them are right in your brain. There are receptors in your muscles. Since your muscles use oxygen and produce CO2 by doing a lot of cellular respiration, they can contribute to regulating the amount of CO2 in your blood. Now there are other receptors up here, because you might well be aware that there are other things that can make your breathing increase than simply CO2 levels. So up here is where we think about pain and emotion. There's some higher centers in your brain that are involved with that, because you're probably well aware, if you are really upset, you will probably have to breathe quicker than if you are relaxed and not upset. So there are lots of things that can control your breathing. We'll focus on the chemical part since gas exchange in the blood is what I want you to know the details of. But if I ask you how to control breathing, you can use any of those things as part of an explanation. Did you have a question? No? So we just have one more thing that I'd like to discuss. And before I show you what I think, I would actually like you to look at some of this yourself. So I'm going to pause here. So the first condition I asked you to look at was bronchitis. And I always put bronchitis and asthma together because they have a very similar result on the person's health, but for a different reason. Now, anytime a word ends with itis, like hepatitis for your liver, meningitis for the meninges which surround your brain, anything that ends with itis means that the tissue is inflamed or infected. So bronchitis is when your bronchi are inflamed or irritated. When this happens, your bronchi, which are the tubes through which air is carried, your bronchi are inflamed and there is more mucus produced. So what this means in the long run is that if I was to look at one of your bronchi and assess its diameter, so let's say that this is a normal bronchiole or bronchi. It's one of the tubes through which air is carried. A normal bronchi would have a thin layer of mucus on it. Most of the tubes in your respiratory system have little hairs that are there to trap dust and allergens that are coming through your respiratory system. Now, when a person has bronchitis, this is what their bronchiole would look like. The mucus layer would be very, very, very thick. And so in a person with bronchitis, see how the diameter is reduced? This means that their ability to bring in air and to bring out air is also reduced. If there's less space in your bronchi, there's less place for air to move. Now, I said I put bronchitis and asthma together because they have the same sort of outcome, which is true, but the reason is different. So in asthma, again, the diameter of the bronchi is reduced. But this time it's not because of mucus production, because there's some sort of infection. This time it's actually because of constriction. So in a person with asthma, their bronchi is simply smaller to start with. They don't have extra thick mucus. They have narrower bronchial passages in the first place. So if you look, the outcome is the same. The actual space here where air can pass is small, but the reason that it's small is different. Would anyone like to ask any questions about bronchitis and asthma? Do you guys have something you want to ask? Then emphysema is the next one. Now, emphysema is a condition that's typically chronic. The word chronic means develops over a long period of time. Bronchitis and asthma are usually acute conditions. So bronchitis is something that will happen all of a sudden and then go away. Asthma is something that, depending on the severity of the condition, usually is not present all the time. You can have asthma attacks, and for a lot of people, the symptoms decrease over time. It's not true for everybody. But emphysema is something chronic that would take a while to develop, but once it has developed, can be quite serious. In emphysema, the alveoli, which are the little sacs of air at the ends of the tubes inside of your lungs, the alveoli burst. And so instead of having, at the end of each of your bronchioles, a nice little set of perfect little grapes, what you would have is a big globby mess, where instead of individual sacs that could perform lots of gas exchange, now we have reduced surface. Reduced surface area means less gas exchange between your lungs and your blood. That means less oxygen in, less CO2 out. Now the last one is lung cancer, and I always like to mention cancer in as many places as I can because some people have the misconception that cancer cells themselves are in some way toxic to you. There's some sort of evil little cancer cell that is out there killing you, and that's actually not what cancer is doing. So that you know, when you have cancer, you generally have a tumor. And what is a tumor? It's your own cells that are growing out of control. And so a tumor is just out of control cell growth. Now, just the fact that your cells are growing out of control all by itself is not what's going to kill you. What would cause the problem is that if you have a tumor inside of your lung, this tumor takes up volume. It also takes up surface, and both of those are essential for breathing. For me to be able to bring air in and take air out, I need to be able to adjust the volume of my thoracic cavity and by proxy the volume of my lungs. If there is a big ball of cells in there taking up space, less air is going to come in on every breath. The other thing it does is it covers up surface. So even air that is coming in might not be exchanged because now some of your alveoli cannot contact the air that is coming in and thus cannot give back to the air to expel some CO2. So these are some conditions that I would want you to know about. Obviously, they're not the only ones that exist in the universe that could affect your lungs, but these are some of the big ones. Would anybody like to ask anything about any of those 4 conditions?